Good morning, everyone. Sorry, we'll get started. So welcome. My name's Anita. I'm the convener of the Climate and Energy College. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Miranda here this morning. Miranda is a PhD student with the Free University of Berlin, but she's also a research associate at the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam. And we actually met a few years ago at a climate engineering conference in Heidelberg. And Berlin, and that was the big year of climate engineering. So those of you that came to my seminar last week, we're having a bit of a climate engineering blitz, and this is a nice continuation on from that. Miranda has a very different focus from me. She's still looking at the climate engineering governance aspects, but she's looking at the interaction between science and society and politics in the way we talk about climate engineering, the way it's constructed discursively. She'll be talking about one of her papers in her research, but feel free to ask her more broadly because she's very well informed. So please welcome her. She'll speak for about 30, 35, 40 minutes maybe, and then we'll have a round of questions.
What's yours? Let's see if this works. Never had one of these types of microphones before. It's quite exciting. All right, well, thanks very much for the introduction, and I'm very excited to be here. I just arrived from Germany yesterday, so if sometimes I seem to lose my train of thought, that may be because my brain is still somewhere in transit, but we'll see how we go. I'm going to talk a little bit, as was already said, about the governance debate around climate engineering. The title of my talk is Cracking the Climate Engineering Governance Code, How Discursive Structures Can Inform Anticipatory Development of a Code of Conduct for Climate Engineering Research. It's a little bit, the focus of this talk is going to be slightly different than the title may suggest, because the focus is going to be on the governance implications more broadly, because I thought that would be of more interest to most people rather than specifically for the code. As we go through, I'll be referring to this code of conduct and how my results relate to the development of the code, but also hopefully showing how my results may have relevance for governance development more broadly. I know that you've already heard a little bit about climate engineering before. How do we get this to move, actually? There we go. Yes, okay. I know you know a little bit about climate engineering already, or geoengineering, depending on how you refer to it, just so I get a bit of a feel about how much detail I should go into. Who here has heard about the concept before and knows quite a bit about it? Okay, so we can skip over some of the more concrete, the more detailed things. All right. So jumping right in, this is just a brief overview. I'm going to give some background, then I'm going to talk about the specific governance challenges related to climate engineering, and I'm going to talk about some past developments just to sort of frame my own work, and then I'm going to talk about the code of conduct very briefly, and then the meat of the talk is going to be in the cracking the code part. The reference, not necessarily a very good one, but I see my work as about just deconstructing the structure of a discourse in a way like reverse engineering the code of a computer program. So that's my play on words there. So hopefully you'll be able to see the way in which I try to deconstruct and then reconstruct, reverse engineer the discourse to find out what the underlying structures can tell us. Yeah, so jumping right in, climate engineering, I don't need to tell you, it seems most of you know what this is. Large-scale intentional interventions into the global climate system with the aim of counteracting some of the effects of climate change, broadly usually divided up into two overarching categories. Carbon dioxide removal, which aims to draw CO2 out of the atmosphere and permanently store it in some form, and solar radiation management, which aims to reduce the amount of solar radiation entering and being trapped at the Earth's surface. These are all, at this stage, very speculative technologies, what we call socio-technical imaginaries. They do not exist in a scalable form, which makes it very interesting to talk about the governance of technologies, emerging technologies at this early stage, looking at the way in which they're being talked about and how that has an effect on the way that they will be developed going forward. I won't go into any more detail about the technical side of things. I'm also a social scientist, so I'm not that well informed about the details, but if you do have questions afterwards, we can discuss it a little bit more. The Royal Society in 2009 published one of the still most well-referenced, most well-cited evaluations, overarching evaluations of climate engineering approaches. And they said the greatest challenges to the successful deployment of geoengineering may be the social, ethical, legal, and political issues associated with governance rather than the scientific and technical issues, which is a starting point for me to jump right into talking about some of these ethical, social, ethical, legal, and political issues. But before we get to that, let's take a step back. What is climate engineering? I gave you the definition that the Royal Society uses, the large-scale, deliberate intervention into global climate systems. But what does that actually mean for governance? It's one of the central questions, I think, and one that I'd like to talk a little bit about before we get into some of the more detailed stuff. So what is the right term? What is the right level of aggregation when it comes to talking about climate engineering? All-encompassing umbrella terms such as climate engineering or geoengineering, or subcategorizations, as I said, carbon dioxide removal or solar radiation management, or potentially individual proposals such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, ocean liming. These are all different levels of aggregation. What's in, what's out? Why does it matter for governance? I'd like to give you a couple of examples to really sort of exemplify why I think this is very important. Why the level of aggregation is very, very important, and the type of definition that is used is very important. So for those of you who have heard of the concepts before, would you say that large-scale manipulation of, for example, the ocean through ion fertilization to increase fish stocks is or isn't climate engineering? Yes, I'd love a response. Come on, I'm not the only one doing the work here.
I would say it is.
Yes, why?
Because it's, if you go back to the Royal Society definition, it's large-scale intervention in Earth processes.
Okay, what's the rest of the Royal Society definition?
I have not memorized it.
It's the large-scale intentional intervention into climate systems for the purpose of mitigating the effects of climate change. So some people, I don't know what the correct answer is, but if you apply the Royal Society definition, then large-scale ocean fertilization, ion ocean fertilization for the purposes of increasing fish stocks is not climate engineering. I would argue this, yeah.
Is it maybe environmental engineering?
Yeah, right, could be. Yeah, it could be. Yeah, so it's what I mean. See, this is a little bit difficult. Another example, what about small-scale manipulation of local biodiversity, for example, through afforestation with the with the intention to counteract climate change? Is that geoengineering or not? Yeah.
If it's a big enough scale,
yeah.
If it involved the Amazon rainforest, it might be.
Mm-hmm. What about if it was locally very small scale, but on the aggregate over the whole planet, had a global effect? Yeah, so I think it's what I'm getting at here, without laboring the point too much, is really that the way technologies are defined and conceptualized affects the way they are governed, and the way they're governed affects the way the technologies will further be developed and conceptualized. So definitional politics really matter in this case. Same thing for governance. What is governance when it comes to talking about climate engineering? It's used in many, many different ways in the field of climate engineering and can often lead to confusion. So I probably don't need to point this out too strongly here, but governance is not just about restricting activities. It's not just about formal structures and institutions, but can also be it can be a broader term, which can refer to concepts ranging from international law on the restrictive side, state action, informal norms, even norms governing personal behavior when approaching research, things like that. So regulation versus governance is an important thing to keep in mind. We can have top-down versus bottom-up type approaches to governance. So governance can take place as scientists or subnational organizations such as this institute voluntarily comply with certain self-imposed rules of practice, or it can be top-down, international organizations, national governments, state governments enforcing binding rules. Same thing, hard law or soft law on the international scale. We can have binding regulations, or we can have sort of naming and shaming approaches to governance. Restrictive versus enabling, I think, is a really important one here when it comes to climate engineering, because most of the time when people hear when they talk about climate engineering governance, they first of all think about restrictive mechanisms, such as banning certain types or regulating the open air, regulation of experiments in the open environment. But a lot of governance can also be an enabling type, increasing the legitimacy of certain types of actions. We'll get into that a little bit more later. So just as a quick summary, the term governance has been used in the field of climate engineering to refer to concepts ranging from international regulations restricting climate engineering to the full-scale deployment, to domestic policies enabling relevant research, and informal norms guiding individual research practice. The fuzziness of the term can lead to miscommunication about the need for governance of climate engineering in some cases. So again, language matters. All right, now moving on to some of the governance challenges. So we know what the fuzziness of the term, the concept of what we're trying to govern. We know the fuzziness of the term governance, and now we can dive into some of the specific challenges to do with governing climate engineering. First of all, on the regulating, restricting side, I'm sure that most of you have a pretty good grasp of some of the major challenges here and why restrictive governance is being called for. But can someone maybe give me a couple of examples of concerns about climate engineering that may require governance?
One, because we don't really understand the climate we're still learning a lot about it, and relatively small actions could have irreversible effects.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, very good.
Okay.
Want someone else?
Let's bring it to this side.
All right, no worries. I won't put anyone under too much pressure. So this is a non-exhaustive list, of course. I don't think I had yours on there, but yeah, the complexity of the climate system is, and the sort of knock-on effects that could be initiated as one of the big ones. But the ones that I'd like to sort of just run through quickly here is the slippery slope argument. That's the argument that without governance, research will inevitably lead to the deployment of some climate engineering technologies. And we have the moral hazard, one of the most common. Who's heard of the moral hazard in connection to climate engineering? Yeah. Explain what the moral hazard is.
So the moral hazard is the idea that once we start talking about it, it's unavoidable. So that it will reduce incentives to decarbonize or to use other actions.
Yeah, so it's a little bit different from the slippery slope in that that's more of technological determinism. Research will create vested interests, which will inevitably lead to deployment, whereas the moral hazard argument is even talking about the concept of climate engineering will potentially distract from mitigation efforts to deal with the root cause of climate change. Vested interests, we just talked about, is the fear that researchers, companies, or governments with a financial or a reputational a stake in experiments or possible deployments may seek to push climate engineering research or deployment in a direction that is ill-advised for society and the global environment as a whole. The termination effect is one that's more of a concern when it comes to the solar radiation management side of things, given the fact that most climate engineering measures would have to be maintained over long periods of time. If the decision were made to deploy, governance would be needed to prevent premature cessation, which could potentially result in very rapid temperature increases. Rogue actors, small actions are possible by a smaller group of people potentially, so governance would be needed to make sure that single state or an individual didn't try to use some types of climate engineering against the will of others. differing national interests are also a point here. Even if a consensus could be reached that some types of climate engineering would be desirable, because regional effects of different types of climate engineering would be differentiated, would be different potentially. There would be conflict without a governance mechanisms in place to decide upon which types of climate engineering and to what intensity. There could be conflicts over pre and post deployment, and attribution problems also related to that. If there was no monitoring mechanisms in place that were trusted and accepted, liability concerns could arise over the effects of certain mechanisms. So that's on the one side, and then on the other side we have another whole set of enabling governance challenges, which include transparency, ensuring that all relevant knowledge and research results in the field of climate engineering are made publicly available. Coordination, increasing coordination between different parties to ensure knowledge transfer and mutual learning, preventing unnecessary replication of results when it comes to research into these things. Mission definition, balancing scientific curiosity about climate engineering. A lot of, especially natural scientists, are like, wow, there's so much, it's fun to find out how this might work, which is valid, but you need to balance that with the potential for social benefit when defining the goals of research. Quality control, assessing if research and or deployment of certain types of climate engineering mechanisms have fulfilled their stated intention, and if not, ensuring cessation or modification of the activities. And legitimacy, establishing mechanisms for public engagement and deliberation about research and deployment, ensuring transparency and accountability throughout the research process. So that's the flip side of the governance challenge. In sum, governance of climate engineering could entail restricting undesirable behaviours such as risky research or unilateral deployment, and or enabling desirable behaviour such as responsible research into the risks and benefits of climate engineering approaches. And it's important that the boundaries of desirable and undesirable behaviour remain to be defined as part of a wider societal debate. So how do we govern climate engineering? It's not a question I'm going to answer today, don't worry. I've got all the answers. So there are many different proposals out there, and it's related a little bit to the definitions of governance that I brought up before. Could be, depending on the type of climate engineering and the level of activity, whether it's research, testing, or deployment, a range of proposals exist about which governance institutions or types of institutions would be most appropriate. Some approaches, like the more localized ones, BECS and Boettcher, may be more suited to regulation via national laws, although international coordination would still be necessary, I think. And SRM, or solar radiation management approaches, because of their inherently transboundary effects, the argument is that there are more calls for international or even supernatural, not supernatural, governance on a higher level. Fragmented versus centralized governance remains to be clarified whether it would be better to unify responsibility for governance of climate engineering research and or deployment in one body. So that would be decision-making, review, monitoring, sanctioning, all of those functions within one body, or distribute across several different bodies. Consensus versus majority. Would an international majority be sufficient to decide upon the use of certain climate engineering approaches? Would it be necessary? Would it be sufficient? Or would a global consensus similar to the Paris Agreement be needed? Public participation. There's a very active ongoing debate regarding the level to which publics should be involved in governance decisions through direct or indirect democratic participation through elected office or through public dialogue. The public's affected, how do we define the public's affected, how do we engage them? So these are all issues that are involved. Yeah, I said I wasn't going to answer the question. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for how to govern climate engineering, and different types of climate engineering activities will likely require flexible adaptive governance mechanisms. Just checking how I'm going for time here. I feel like I'm talking quite slowly. All right, past developments. I'll just go through this quite quickly because it's just to give you a bit of context. So Some customary international law applies to climate engineering. Relevant environmental principles, as outlined in by the Rio Declaration, include like the preventative principle, the no harm principle, the duty of notification and consultation. So if one nation is conducting an experiment owing to climate engineering, they have the duty to notify and to consult with other states who may be affected by their activities. The polluter pays principle may apply to climate engineering research that crosses national boundaries. And the precautionary principle is an interesting one that is very open to interpretation in how it may apply to climate engineering. Maybe I know that you mentioned to me before that you've been looking into international governance, so maybe you know what the precautionary principle is and can give us a bit of a rundown of it.
Sure.
Yeah.
So the precautionary principle is the notion that we don't not act because we don't have sound scientific understanding of whatever the problem is.
Yeah.
So in the sense that perhaps climate change, we shouldn't not mitigate climate change simply because we don't fully understand the processes involved in the climate system. In relation to geoengineering, I guess it could fall either side, that perhaps we need to geoengineer because of how dire climate change is. And so geoengineering could actually be, in that sense, taking a precautionary approach to addressing climate change. The flip side of that is there are so many question marks and uncertainties around geoengineering that a precautionary approach would also say we can't deploy these technologies until we have a greater understanding of them.
So it's one of the ones that's a little bit, there's a grey area. We don't have enough scientific knowledge to know if climate engineering is a good thing or not, but precautionary principle says don't wait. So it's a difficult one. All right, so just customary international law principles may in some ways apply to climate engineering. National laws such as environmental protection laws and laws relating to freedom of scientific research could potentially apply to climate engineering. There are subnational mechanisms like university ethics councils, peer review processes, independent assessment procedures, funding agency stipulations which apply to climate engineering research, and there are informal principles such as responsible research ethics and transparency through publication, sort of customary informal principles that apply. Some international treaty regimes could apply to climate engineering. The Convention on Biological Diversity has basically said no deployment, but research is okay, especially related to the effects on biodiversity. The London Convention, London Protocol has spoken about ocean iron fertilization and is in process at the moment to expand an annex that could potentially have some say over different types of marine-based climate engineering. Basically also saying scientific research is okay, but nothing that with commercial interests involved and nothing that would be considered deployment. The United Nations Convention on Climate Change has no direct reference to climate engineering methods, but the Paris Agreement sets the goal of holding the global average temperature increase to well below 2 degrees. And the model scenarios that they're basing most of their projections on rely upon negative emissions technologies, BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And some have said that the Paris Agreement definition of mitigation, which is protecting and enhancing greenhouse gas, I think man-made and natural greenhouse gas sinks, could be read as could be interpreted to include carbon dioxide removal or negative emissions technologies. And the special report on 1.5 degrees that came out last year did make reference quite significantly to the need for investigation of carbon dioxide removal approaches. Why is this not working? Am I doing something wrong, or do I? No, it's just, it falls asleep. There we go. All right. So just in summary, that was just a very rushed and not complete, but very basic overview of some of the existing governance principles that apply to climate engineering. So climate engineering is not emerging in a governance vacuum, and some existing governance principles apply, although how actors will interpret the various obligations in light of climate engineering is not yet clear. I think I'm going to skip over this because in the interest of time, there have been several small scale experiments in the ambient environment find out more about specific types of climate engineering approaches, and they had some interesting consequences for the understanding of the way governance should be should co-evolve along with research. So if you've got questions about that later, we can potentially discuss it, but in the interest of time, I will skip through. So just in some experiments that pose absolutely no environmental risk can raise governance concerns. These are the main points that came out of these other experiments. An engagement between science policymakers and stakeholders is essential to the development of anticipatory and adaptive climate engineering research governance. And research is ongoing. Governance and research are co-evolving within a complex discourse, and these different types of stakeholders need to be able to communicate effectively with each other. All right, so one of the ways in which governance is evolving is through this proposed code of conduct for responsible scientific research involving geoengineering, a bit of a complex name, blame the lawyers. These are two of my former colleagues who are legal scholars who worked at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies and reviewed existing legal principles and did a very good job of coming up with a framework of a code of conduct that's meant to be an adaptive, flexible set of rules that can provide practical guidance on the responsible conduct of geoengineering research. It's designed primarily as a voluntary instrument based on existing legal sources, including general principles, rules of customary international law, treaty-based rules, regulations, and so forth. And as part of a project involving my institute and the University of Oxford and the University of Calgary, where Anna Maria, one of the authors of the code, is now a professor, we in 2016 set up a project to further develop this draft code of conduct in a participatory manner by talking to, getting the code reviewed by legal experts, conducting a series of semi-structured interviews with people at the science policy interface in the US, the UK, and Germany. And we had an open call for comments online for interested members of the public. And we also conducted some workshops in which the code was applied by a group of experts to proposed experiments in the ambient environment. So through this process, the code has been further developed and refined. And I'm going to be presenting today the results of my analysis of the semi-structured interviews. I am, my background is in linguistics and political science, and I've since combined those two things and moved them into sort of a combination of science and technology studies and political science, post-structural discourse analysis. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the theoretical background to my approach later on. But basically what I'm doing is trying to map the discursive structures underlying US, UK, and German governance policy experts' reactions to the code, and drawing out the implications of these discursive patterns for anticipatory governance development of the code specifically, and climate engineering research governance more broadly. So as I said, post-structural discourse theory. I'm not going to go into great detail about the theoretical background and the methodological approach because I thought that was potentially not of such interest, but if you have questions about that later, we can go into it. But yeah, I combine post-structural discourse theory with science and technology studies approach. So I assume that a discourse is an underlying system of concepts and practices that constitutes the phenomena of which it speaks. The systematic relationships between discursive elements can be reconstructed, and the discursive structure goes a long way to defining what constitutes legitimate knowledge and shapes whose knowledge matters when we're talking about emerging technologies and their governance. On the science and technology side, we're interested in understanding how scientific knowledge, technology, and societal structures co-produce each other by tracing the emergence and stabilization of new socio-technical objects and framings, and the processes by which the products of technoscience become intelligible across boundaries, just as a brief overview. So, based on these theoretical underpinnings, I developed a framework for assessing the following questions when it comes to the code of conduct. So as I said, data pool was a set of 25 interviews with policymakers or people at the science policy interface in the US, the UK, and Germany. And I conducted a qualitative discourse analysis using a program called MaxQDA, which involves inductive coding and finding overarching categories and then setting those categories in relation to each other to establish the overarching structure of the debate. The questions that I was asking this data was when people are talking about climate engineering governance, what are they talking about governing? What is governance to them? What terms are being created? Why govern? What demand rationales are underpinning the call for governance? And who governs? What authoritative speaker positions are being created by the structure of the discourse? So we're going to go through this step by step, and I'll point out the structures that I identified and then try and draw out the implications for the development of the code and climate engineering research governance more broadly. So what is being constructed as the objects which should or should not be governed by the code of conduct? This is my attempt to visually represent the structural outlines of this particular part of the analysis. So I found that the object of governance was discussions about the object of governance were structured by patterns of external differentiation and internal specification. That means that what was climate engineering or what wasn't climate engineering was externally differentiated based on intent, as we talked about before. Most of the interviewees that I talked to were using the notion of intent to differentiate what is climate engineering and what isn't climate engineering. So that's the outer lighter blue is not climate engineering, and within is what is climate engineering, addressing the effect of climate change. Within the internal specification room space, the patterns of internal differentiation were based on the scale and effect of the different climate engineering approaches. So as you can see here, there's a two-dimensional space, whether they were on a transboundary or local to national spatial range, or whether the so this is the So on this axis is the scale, and this is the effect to either alter solar radiation or remove CO2. So within this space, there are transboundary approaches which activities which alter solar radiation, aim to alter solar radiation and have transboundary effects. So that would be SRM or solar radiation management approaches. And then we have activities which alter solar radiation with local to national effects, activities which remove CO2 with transboundary effects, and other activities which remove CO2 with local to national effects. So these findings have a range of implications for the development of CE governance in general and the code of conduct specifically. These are some examples, but I'll skip over this. On the one hand, if patterns of external differentiation related to intent become central to definitions of climate engineering for governance purpose, the CE governance object will be relatively singular, because as we said, the people who are using patterns of external differentiation only use a lumping category by saying everything that intends to mitigate the effects of climate change is climate engineering. So it would be a large unitary governance object. But the boundaries of this unified object will be extremely broad, and governance frameworks will correspondingly need to be designed to be flexible and adaptable to the wide range of climate engineering research activities which fall within this encompassing definition. On the other hand, if patterns of internal specification related to scale and effect become fundamental to definitions of climate engineering for governance purposes, the governance objects will be pluralized. And the boundaries of these multiple governance objects will be much narrower, and governance mechanisms, therefore, will need to be developed to be more specific to individual CE research activities. So what that means for the code is, at the moment, the code of conduct is written in a way that makes it flexible and adaptable, enough to be applied to a really broad range of climate engineering research activities. So more of, if patterns of external differentiation continue to be central, then that would mean that the code as is would be broad enough to apply to that very large single governance object. But if patterns of internal specification lead to the sort of solidification of multiple objects of climate engineering research governance, specific versions of the code may need to be developed to apply more explicitly to these individual governance objects. So yeah, external differentiation based on intent. Heterogeneous governance object means one size fits all governance, very broad governance necessary. Internal specification based on scale effect, plural governance objects, tailor-made governance for specific approaches. Next question, what is governance? How is the term governance being defined in relation to the code? Got another beautiful picture here. My analysis showed that there's no unifying definition of governance, we know that, shared by all interviews, but I did identify this shared discursive structures underpinning the way in which definitions were conceptualized. All of the different definitions of governance that were being used by the people I interviewed were located within a conceptual space with a functional governance dimension, so controlling or restricting versus enabling governance, and a spatial dimension, local or compartmentalized versus transnational and interconnected. So that's, as you can see here, this is not very good using this. Yeah. I have some examples here, I think, that I should show you. Oh, just one, an example of the way in which a specific interviewee was positioning their governance concept on both the functional and spatial dimensions. Governance should be national and international. I think that if you don't have national guidelines, the full gambit from voluntary guidelines to more robust sort of forms of binding governance at the national level, then the subnational actors will backfill it, and you get a chaotic environment, which is not good. So you can see that this is just an example of the way in which different positionings are happening within a shared discursive space. So what implications does this finding have for the development of climate engineering research governance? So understanding the common discursive structure underpinning different definitions of research governance can help researchers and policymakers and other relevant stakeholders locate their respective definitions within this two-dimensional space. It will help facilitate, hopefully, better mutual understanding among various stakeholders about the different governance definitions, so they can understand where their governance definition is positioned relative to others within this two-dimensional space, and what that means for their respective understandings of what is necessary. Also, this can form the appropriate pathways towards implementation of different types of climate engineering governance. So if a certain community or a certain discourse develops in a way that focuses on controlling restricting controlling side and the compartmentalized local, that would mean national legislation would probably be most appropriate for fulfilling those needs, but transnational, interconnected, restricting, controlling international laws, and things in the middle like contextualized rules. These are examples that came out of the interviews as well for people who positioned their governance concept in this way, suggested ways in which the code of conduct could be operationalized, either as a basis for national legislation, as a basis for international laws, as a basis for conceptualized rules, or even for scientific self-governance if your governance definition is on the enabling side and doesn't really take the transnational or interconnected aspect into such central consideration. So yes. The next question is why govern? Which demand rationales are underpinning calls for climate engineering research governance? And I identified 3 main overarching demand rationales: the functional, which has an economic logic; the strategic, which has a political logic; and the normative, which has an ethical logic. So the functional, we'll just go through a couple of examples. The functional logic sees governance as a rational problem, solving driven by utilitarian cost-benefit calculations and risk management concepts. So according to this type of demand rationale, research governance is needed for the purpose of protecting the environment and human health, reducing the risk of unintended environmental and societal consequences, and encouraging the useful climate engineering research. And I'm not going to go through them, but on the far right, you can see some examples that are taken from the interviews themselves. So that's the functional rationale. And we have a strategic, which is governance is needed to protect national interests, particularly relating to security and economic stability, and motivated by a desire to influence, either change or maintain, the balance of power. So according to this rationale, research governance is needed for the purpose of averting conflict, preventing rogue research, and preparing. This is a sort of, someone else is going to do it, so we need to be prepared sort of logic. And the normative governance is needed, or governance is needed to strengthen existing norms and create new ones, motivated by a desire to ensure or increase global justice and equality. So research governance is needed for facilitating global discussions about research governance, setting shared norms, ensuring research is conducted responsibly, creating transparency about research, and establishing democratic legitimacy. So all 3 of these were present in the structure that I identified. But as you can see from the table, there's a few more types of rationales that were falling under the normative rationale heading, which is an interesting finding in and of itself, although of course it's just preliminary findings and would need to be, the data pool would need to be expanded to see if these types of rationales are also underpinning other calls for governance. But these findings are especially interesting in light of suggestions put forward recently by one of my colleagues, Kino Jinna, who sort of takes theories of global governance and applies them to try and put together a sort of demand-based. She tries to give some indication of how we could translate empirical findings on demand rationales into governance design principles. So applying her insights from theories of global governance, she suggests a given constellation of functional, strategic, and normative demand rationales can inform appropriate control mechanisms and the degree of polycentricity when designing governance mechanisms for emerging technology. So these are these 2 axes. We've got the demand rationales here and the demand constellations. So she says, if demands predominantly adhere to a functional demand rationale, governance suited to meeting these demands would likely be technocratic in nature. If demands are largely strategic, her framework would suggest the appropriateness of hegemonic governance structures. And if normative demands dominate, democratic structures focused on enhancing legitimacy and inclusiveness would be deemed more suitable. Further, she says, if all 3 types of demand rationales are equally present, strongly polycentric governance architecture would be most appropriate. And on the flip side, if one type of demand rationale clearly dominates calls for governance, her framework suggests that a centralized governance structure may correspondingly be more suitable to meeting those demands. So this table sort of outlines those intersecting relationships between demand rationales and the resulting implications for governance. And given that my results reveal that there are 3 types of governance demand rationales present, all 3 are present, her demand-based theory of governance design would suggest that a strongly polycentric governance structure would be most appropriate. But at the same time, the fact that I identified a slightly larger range of reasons for the need for climate engineering research governance adhering to the normative rationale, it suggests that democratic governance structures focusing on enhancing legitimacy and inclusiveness in decision-making on CE research would be most suitable to address these specific demand rationales. So yeah, heterogeneous demand rationales plus a slight predominance of normative rationales would suggest the need for a strongly polycentric and democratic governance. It's down the bottom there in her categorization. Right, who governs? The last point of analysis here. So I was interested in looking at what authoritative speaker positions are available within the climate engineering governance debate. And I identified three main speaker positions. The principled gatekeeper, which posits governance as a way to strengthen existing norms, and I'll just say I've got these three: the principled gatekeeper, the conflict preventer, the responsible information provider. These are legitimate speaker positions, and then we have the self-benefit maximizer, who's kind of outside of the legitimate discursive space, but is really necessary to provides the sort of the rationale for the other three. We'll just I'll go through some examples here, maybe make that a little bit clearer. So each speaker position is associated with a specific demand rationale and implies a set of governance roles, and is often associated with certain types of social actors. So the principal gatekeeper is a normative demand rationale, and the governance roles are ensuring accountability in the development of government, pushing issues onto the governance agenda, facilitating communication, and representing the rights and interests of the underrepresented. Unsurprisingly, is often associated with civil society organizations, but not exclusively. Responsible information provider adheres to a relative, quite often to the functional demand rationale. It's about providing objective information to decision makers to inform the development of problem-specific governance mechanisms, explaining or demonstrating the scientific grounds for the need for governance of a particular activity, and providing ongoing input in the decision-making process, and providing evidence of the effectiveness of specific governance mechanisms. These are scientists, not just natural scientists, but including political scientists and others like ourselves. Strategic controller, strategic demand rationale, as the name suggests. Governance roles, developing leverage to constrain undesirable research activity and prevent conflict, providing robust authorization for desirable or useful research, engaging in long-term strategic societal and environmental planning to inform governance goals. And the final one is the one that's outside the boundaries of the authoritative discursive space. It's denied authority when it comes to governance, but the roles that are the negative governance roles that are associated with it: generating profit through research and technology development, close holding information gained from research in an attempt to maintain competitiveness, and incentivizing profitable but not always useful research. So it's often assigned to nebulous others, industrial actors sometimes implied. I'm running out of time, aren't I? Okay, I'm almost done. All right, governance implications of identifying these speaker positions will be helping stakeholders engage in the governance debate more consistently and consciously. They'll be able to identify their own speaker position and the speaker position of others. They can strategically decide to adopt a different speaker position potentially. And it also suggests a roadmap for the specialization of governance roles. If you know your speaker position, you know which roles are associated with it. Potentially, there could be some burden sharing of different types of governance roles. Oh, why is that happening? Okay. All right, just quickly, my final two slides. I'm sorry, I went a little bit over time. So in summary, the discursive structures I identified in response to govern what? Governance objects formation is underpinned by patterns of external differentiation based on intent and internal specification based on scale effect. Heterogeneous governance terms are all situated within a shared conceptual space bounded by spatial, local to transnational, and a functional dimension restrictive to enabling. 3 central narrative logics: a structure and calls for CE research, functional economic logic, and strategic political logic, and a normative ethical logic. And 3 speaker positions identified, each associated with specific types of social actors. The governance implications are of the govern what question. Governance based on CE activities should be broad and adaptive. Governance based on scale effect should be narrow and specific. in relation to what is governance findings, CE governance should be reflectively positioned both spatially and functionally. Multi-layered CE research governance is appropriate to the ongoing heterogeneous definitional debate. Polycentric democratic governance structures focused on enhancing legitimacy and inclusiveness may be best suited to the current demand constellation. And reflexively engaging with speaker positions available within the governance debate can inform the specification of governance roles for a range of social actors. Takeaways. Governance discourses form the objects of which they speak, bound the ways in which different types of governance can be legitimately called for, and constrain who is assigned authority to govern. Mapping the CE discourse can help to inform the development of anticipatory, context-appropriate governance. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Miranda. Do we have some questions? Can I jump in with a question then? Are you okay? I usually like to start with a woman. So is there anyone here that we'll start with Pia and then we'll go to you.
Thanks so much, Miranda. That was super interesting. I know you were running out of time a little bit at the end there, but I was interested in that fourth area of sort of roles that you talked about, and whether you could elaborate on, I thought that you were implying that idea of reflexivity, and that if you understood the roles that were available to you, that potentially you could use them in a different way. But I thought that you were sort of implying that people could even change roles. And I wondered if you had any examples of, thinking that through. Can civil society actors behave like scientists, or do you mean, that they can? They were two of the potential roles that you had. Yeah, what does that mean in practice?
Okay. Are we gathering, or are we answering straight away?
I think we'll just answer each one as we go.
That's good, because I've got terrible memories. Well, post-structural discourse analysis says that the structure of a given discourse provides speaker positions that don't have to be adopted by social actors. So I think that people can even change their speaker position from one day to the next, or within the same text. So I'm focused more on the sort of stereotypical, in a way, sort of idealized speaker positions, and they don't necessarily have to adopt all elements of that one speaker position. It's just sort of mapping them out and saying, look, these are the ones that are being consistently reproduced by the discursive structure. Take if you want. I see actors as they're limited in what they can say within the discursive boundaries of possibility, but within that space, they can sort of strategically select certain elements to reproduce, if that makes sense. So practically, civil society does try to act. I would say in some cases, civil society people that I interviewed did see themselves as responsible information providers. In some cases, right? They're providing information to decision makers in the same way, or they like to think in the same way that they're an expert just as much as a natural scientist is. So they're adopting that responsible information provider speaker position in that moment. That's the thing. That's where they can sort of the boundaries of the discursive space and the structure within it would make it more difficult for them to be legitimately accepted as adopting that. Yeah, so there's assigning and adopting speaker positions. And so they would never be assigned that speaker position, but they can try and adopt it. Yeah.
Hi, thanks, Miranda. I wondered if you could elaborate more on this benefit maximizer. I'm thinking of scenarios in the future, given the evolving climate, where communities around the world some will be urgent and desperate, that some will be largely unaffected, some will be urgent and desperate, and there might be a role for someone who is trying to minimize the harm to themselves rather than maximizing their benefit. Is there also I just wondered if you could tease that out. You've put the benefit maximizer outside the three functional groups you've nominated, the three groups you've nominated. Have you also thought about a speaker who'll say, hey, I'm drowning, and I'm the Pacific Islands and I'm drowning, I need someone to act? I'm just...
Yeah, no, that one is one that comes up quite a lot. I mean, but not necessarily. I mean, not necessarily within the governance debate when it comes to this. This would be still outside the governance space, because they are people who would then potentially need to be governed rather than being involved in the creation of governance. But yes, I mean, this is also part of the paper that I'm writing, is looking at the dogs that don't bark, right? The things that are outside the discursive space, because just finding out what's within the discursive space is only half the story. You want to find out what's excluded, and that would be one that I think is well worth discussing. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, yeah, thank you for your talk.
I'm sorry, you're
I'm
over
over
there.
here. So you talked early on about the sort of the wider implications of geoengineering as being, you know, potentially unknown, unintended consequences of geoengineering. But from a methodological point of view, you were talking with sort of experts at the science policy interface, you know, from a fairly limited pool from the UK, Germany and the US. What sort of reflexivity was there amongst these actors about their role in speaking for others? And from your point of view, what sort of reflexivity do you have as a researcher about, I suppose, that wider discursive space?
Yeah, that's a really good one. I'm actually trying really hard to expand my interview partner pool to talk to people from a wider range of countries. Unfortunately, language restrictions make it sometimes a little bit difficult. But yeah, it's super important to do that, of course. Within, like, the people that I talk to, a lot of them pointed, like, they're like, why are you just talking to me? Why aren't you talking to, you know, people from a wider range of countries? So there is that reflexivity there, definitely. Especially when talking to people who engage with civil society, because they consciously adopt the responsibility for speaking for people who don't have a voice. So that reflexivity is definitely there, for sure. Yeah.
I think we're running out of time, so unless anyone's bursting for a question, I'll ask one and then we might wrap up. So you talked interchangeably throughout your seminar about governance of climate engineering and governance of the research of climate engineering. Do you see them as one and the same thing?
That's a difficult one. Specifically this, I mean, maybe I had a bit of a slip when I didn't always add research, but this project was specifically talking to people about governing research, because the code of conduct is about governing research. But my interviewees and myself included find it very difficult to draw that line between what is research. There's another element that I kind of wanted to include in my two-dimensional discursive space, but it's a little bit difficult to include. It's another thing that plays a huge role when talking about the formation of governance objects. When we're talking about governing CE research, where does research end and where does deployment begin? It's tied mostly to questions of scale, and a scale, both geographic scale and temporal scale. So yeah, we are okay, and we're out of time. Right.
We are, but we have one online question, I think.
Okay.
So we'll take the online question because we always want to make sure that they feel like they're included.
Yeah.
And then we might wrap up.
Jane, can you pose your comment or question?
Oh, I was just going to say that in terms of international governance, that another. Can you hear me? I don't think this is working.
Okay, it's working kind of.
Oh, I just wrote a comment about international governance in terms of another convention which may provide some insight is the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. So it was a comment rather than a question.
I think we'll end it there. Thanks, Miranda. If you can just give her another round of applause, that was great. I just want to let you know that we have tonight, we have a speaker on hydrogen, which seems to be the issue of the moment. Japan's transition to a hydrogen society, the role of Japanese renewables and Victorian brown coal, which is being held over at the Copland Theatre tonight at 6 p.m. So please register if you wanted to go to that one. We also have Tim, who's at the back here, talking to us on Friday next week, the 22nd, on Australia's emissions budget for Paris and demystifying that. And that one's getting popular. So if you do want to attend in person, please register soon. And I'll tell you about the March ones later. But go onto our website for any information on those. Thanks again.